The Texas hill country stretched endlessly in shades of green and gold as the autumn sun began its descent behind the distant peaks. Running Elk moved silently through the pine forest, his moccasins making no sound on the carpet of fallen needles. He had been tracking a deer for most of the afternoon, following sign that spoke clearly to eyes trained since childhood to read the language of the wilderness. At 32 years old, he had lived alone in these mountains for nearly 5 years, choosing solitude over the complications of the world below. His cabin sat in a hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow pass that most travelers never noticed. It was a simple structure built with his own hands from timber and stone, weathered by mountain storms, but solid and secure. Running Elk had everything he needed for survival. A small garden that produced vegetables through the warm months, traps and hunting skills that kept him fed, and a spring that provided clear, cold water year-round. What he did not have, and what he told himself he no longer wanted, was human connection. As the light began to fade, and Running Elk considered abandoning the hunt for the day, he heard something that made him freeze mid-step. A child's voice, thin and frightened, calling out words he recognized as English, though he understood only some of them. The voice came again, closer now, mixed with the sound of small branches breaking and stones being disturbed by clumsy feet. Running Elk's first instinct was to move away, to avoid whatever trouble that voice represented. Contact with settlers had brought his people nothing but loss and grief. But the voice called again, and this time he heard the raw terror beneath the words. Running Elk closed his eyes and saw another child's face from years ago, his own daughter, her laughter forever silenced by fever when she was barely 3 years old. His wife had followed her into death just days later, and the double loss had broken something fundamental inside him. He had left his tribe shortly after, unable to bear the sympathy in their eyes or the empty space where his family should have been. Now standing in the darkening forest, he knew he could not walk away from a frightened child, regardless of who she was or what complications she might bring. Running Elk moved toward the voice, making enough noise that he would not startle the child into running. He found her in a small clearing, a tiny figure with tangled blonde hair and a dress torn by branches and thorns. Her face was streaked with tears and dirt, and she could not have been more than 6 years old. When she saw Running Elk emerge from the trees, she gasped and stumbled backward, clearly terrified of the tall Comanche warrior in traditional clothing appearing like a spirit from the forest shadows. Running Elk raised his hands slowly, palms forward, in the universal gesture of peace. He spoke softly in Comanche, knowing she would not understand the words, but hoping his tone would communicate that he meant no harm. The girl stared at him with wide blue eyes, trembling but too exhausted to run. Running Elk slowly removed his water pouch and held it out to her, miming the action of drinking. After a long hesitation, the child took a tentative step forward, then another, until she could reach for the water. She drank desperately, and Running Elk waited patiently until she was finished. Using the few English words he knew and mostly gestures, Running Elk tried to understand the girl's situation. Through her frightened, broken responses, he pieced together a tragic story. Her family had been traveling through the mountains in a wagon when something had happened. She could not or would not explain exactly what, and she had become separated from them. She had been wandering alone for at least 2 days, surviving on water from streams and growing increasingly desperate and lost. Running Elk searched the area and found tracks that told a grim tale. Wagon wheels, then signs of the wagon going over a steep embankment into a rocky ravine where no one could have survived. As darkness fell completely and the temperature began to drop, Running Elk faced a decision that echoed the one he had made 5 years ago when choosing isolation. He could take the child to the nearest settlement, a day's journey away, and hand her over to authorities who might or might not care for her properly. Or he could bring her to his cabin for the night, keep her safe and warm, and figure out the best course of action in the morning light. The second option was complicated and risky, but as he looked at the exhausted child shivering in the growing cold, Running Elk knew there was really only one choice. He gestured for her to follow him and began walking toward his hidden valley. The girl hesitated only a moment before trailing after him, her small hand eventually reaching out to grip the fringe of his buckskin shirt as they navigated the darkening trail. Running Elk felt that small hand like a weight and a promise, reminding him of all he had lost and all he had tried to forget. As they walked through the mountain pass and descended into his secluded valley, the first stars began to appear in the deepening blue sky above. The cabin was cold when they arrived, and Running Elk quickly built up the fire while the girl stood near the door, looking around with frightened curiosity. He prepared a simple meal of corn cakes and dried meat, softening them in broth over the fire. The child ate ravenously, and Running Elk watched her with emotions he had thought long buried stirring uncomfortably in his chest. When she finally finished eating, her eyes began to droop with exhaustion. Running Elk gave her his own sleeping. Furzan made his bed by the fire, positioning himself between the door and the child in an instinctive gesture of protection. As he lay awake listening to her breathing settle into the rhythm of sleep, Running Elk wondered what morning would bring. He had broken his self-imposed isolation for the first time in 5 years, and he could feel the carefully constructed walls around his heart beginning to crack. Outside, the mountain night was filled with the sounds of wind through pines and the distant call of an owl. Running Elk did not know that by dawn his small valley would be transformed in ways that would challenge everything he thought he had left behind. Running Elk woke before dawn, as he always did, to the faint grey light filtering through the gaps in the cabin's wooden shutters. For a moment he lay still, listening to the unfamiliar sound of another person breathing in his home. The child was still asleep, curled beneath the furs like a small animal seeking warmth and safety. Running Elk rose quietly and moved to the door, intending to step outside for his morning ritual of greeting the sun and checking the surrounding area for any signs of danger or change. What he saw when he opened the door made him freeze in absolute astonishment. His hidden valley, which yesterday had been empty except for his own presence, was now filled with horses. Not just a few horses, but hundreds of them, spread across the meadow like a living carpet of brown, black, white, and spotted colors. They grazed peacefully in the morning mist that rose from the damp grass, their presence transforming the landscape into something from a dream or vision. For several heartbeats, Running Elk simply stared, unable to process what his eyes were telling him. Then he saw the people. Comanche warriors and families were camped at the far edge of the valley, their traditional teepees forming a small village that had appeared overnight like mushrooms after rain. Smoke rose from morning fires, and Running Elk could see figures moving among the shelters, beginning their daily routines. His heart began to pound as recognition flooded through him. This was not just any Comanche group. These were people from his own band, the community he had left 5 years ago to nurse his grief in solitude. And standing at the front of the camp, clearly waiting for Running Elk to emerge, was a figure he would have recognized anywhere: his younger brother. Swift Arrow running. Elk stepped fully outside, his mind racing with questions and emotions he could not name. Swift Arrow saw him immediately and began walking up the slope toward the cabin, moving with the confident grace that had always characterized him. Behind Swift Arrow came 2 other figures, an elder named Wise Crow, who had been a counselor and spiritual guide to their band for decades, and a woman Running Elk recognized as Morning Star, who had been a healer and friend to his late wife. The delegation approached slowly, giving Running Elk time to adjust to their presence and decide how he would receive them. When they stood face to face for the first time in 5 years, Running Elk felt the full weight of everything he had abandoned washing over him. Swift Arrow had aged, his face showing new lines and his hair touched with streaks of gray that had not been there before. But his eyes were the same, filled with a mixture of love, concern, and determination. He spoke first, his voice steady and warm, greeting his brother in the traditional way and expressing joy at finding him alive and well. Running Elk responded automatically with the proper words, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears after so many years of silence. Wise Crow stepped forward and explained why they had come, speaking with the careful dignity that had made him respected throughout their people. He told Running Elk that the band had been searching for him for months, following rumors and tracking signs across half of Texas. They had brought the horses as a gift, a demonstration of respect, and an offering that represented the collective wealth of the community. The horses were not just animals, but symbols of everything Running Elk had walked away from: family, belonging, responsibility, and the possibility of a future beyond grief and isolation. Morningstar added her voice to the conversation, speaking of how the band had struggled in Running Elk's absence. He had been one of their best hunters and scouts, a warrior whose skills and judgment were deeply missed. But more than his practical contributions, they missed him as a person, as a brother and friend whose presence had strengthened the community in ways that went beyond mere survival. She looked at Running Elk, with eyes that saw through his defenses and spoke directly to the wounded soul beneath. She told him that grief was natural and necessary, but that 5 years was long enough to mourn alone. It was time to consider whether isolation was healing or simply another form of dying. Running Elk listened to all of this with a tumult of emotions churning inside him. Part of him wanted to send them away, to retreat back into the comfortable numbness of solitude, where nothing could hurt him because nothing mattered enough to cause pain. But another part, a part he had tried to suppress for 5 years, stirred with longing and possibility. Before he could formulate a response, a small sound from the cabin doorway made everyone turn. The little settler girl stood there, rubbing sleep from her eyes, looking confused and frightened by the sudden presence of so many strangers. The reaction from the delegation was immediate and telling. Morningstar moved toward the child with gentle concern, speaking softly in Comanche while making soothing gestures. Swift Arrow looked at Running Elk with a new understanding dawning in his eyes, seeing the situation with sudden clarity. Wise Crow nodded slowly, as if this unexpected element confirmed something he had suspected or hoped for. The child instinctively moved closer to Running Elk, seeking protection from the only person she recognized in this strange new world. Running Elk found himself explaining the situation, describing how he had found the girl lost in the mountains and had taken her in for the night, intending to find her a proper home in the morning. But even as he spoke, he realized how hollow his words sounded. The truth was more complicated than simple charity. In the few hours the child had been in his care, something had shifted inside him. Her small hand gripping his shirt, her trust despite every reason to be afraid, her vulnerability that called to something deep in his warrior's heart. All of it had cracked open the walls he had built around himself. Morningstar examined the girl with practiced efficiency, checking for injuries or illness, and declared her fundamentally healthy despite her ordeal. Through gestures and the few English words Running Elk knew, they learned that the child's name was Sarah. Morningstar suggested that Sarah could stay with the band temporarily while they searched for any surviving relatives or determined where she should properly go. The Comanche people, despite all their conflicts with settlers, did not make war on children or abandon those in need. It was a matter of honor and humanity that transcended the boundaries others tried to draw between peoples. Swift Arrow made the offer that Running Elk had been both dreading and hoping for since the moment he saw the valley filled with horses. He invited Running Elk to return to the band, to come home and take his place again among his people. The horses were not just a gift, but a bridge, a way to rebuild the life Running Elk had abandoned. Swift Arrow spoke of children in the band who needed guidance, of young warriors who could benefit from Running Elk's experience, of a community that would be strengthened by his return. And he spoke of Sarah, suggesting that perhaps this lost child had found her way to Running Elk's door for a reason that went beyond simple accident. As the sun climbed higher and burned away the morning mist, Running Elk stood surrounded by the representatives of his past and the small girl who represented an unexpected future. The valley filled with horses seemed to shimmer in the growing light, hundreds of animals representing possibility and connection. Running Elk thought about the 5 years he had spent alone, the grief he had nursed like a precious possession, and the slow realization that isolation had not healed him, but had simply frozen him in place. He looked down at Sarah, who had moved close enough to grip his hand with surprising strength for someone so small, and felt something long dormant stirring in his chest. Running Elk had not spoken his decision aloud, but everyone present could see it forming in his expression, in the way he looked at the horses, and then back at his brother, in how his hand tightened protectively around Sarah's small fingers. The valley that had been his refuge from pain was about to become something else entirely, a bridge between the life he had lost and the life he might still build. As Morningstar began preparing food, and Swift Arrow started explaining the band's current situation and plans. Running Elk realized that dawn had brought not just light, but transformation. The kind that happens when a person finally chooses to step back into the world, despite all the risks that choice entails. The days following the tribe's arrival in Running Elk's Valley transformed into something between a celebration and a homecoming. The Comanche families set up temporary camps throughout the meadow, their presence bringing life and energy to a place that had known only silence for years. Children played among the horses, their laughter echoing off the mountain walls, while elders gathered around evening fires to share stories and wisdom. Running Elk found himself slowly reintegrating into the community he had abandoned, rediscovering rhythms and connections he had thought lost forever. The little girl whom Singing Bird had begun calling Morning Star because she had appeared at dawn like a gift from the spirits, adapted to her new circumstances with the remarkable resilience of children. She remained shy and often overwhelmed by the sudden abundance of people after days of terrifying isolation, but she stayed close to Running Elk with an attachment that spoke of deep need and growing trust. Singing Bird took on the role of grandmother with natural grace, teaching Morning Star simple words in Comanche while learning bits of English from the child, creating a bridge of language that grew stronger each day. But the situation was complicated in ways that could not be ignored. Morning Star was a white child being raised among the Comanche at a time when tensions between settlers and indigenous peoples ran dangerously high across Texas. Swift Arrow called a council on the third day to discuss the implications and risks of keeping the girl. The gathered elders and warriors debated with the seriousness the situation demanded, weighing compassion against practical concerns, honor against survival, the right thing to do against the safe thing to do. Some argued that keeping Morning Star would bring unwanted attention from the army or vigilante groups who might see the child's presence as evidence of wrongdoing. Others pointed out that returning her to settler authorities would likely result in her being placed in an orphanage or workhouse where conditions could be harsh and uncaring. A few voices suggested that the child represented an opportunity, a living symbol that the Comanche people valued all children, regardless of their origin, a potential bridge between communities that desperately needed understanding rather than more conflict. Running Elk listened to all perspectives before speaking, and when he finally stood to address the council, his voice carried the weight of personal conviction earned through loss and hard-won wisdom. He acknowledged the risks, but argued that abandoning Morning Star would mean abandoning their own values and principles. The Comanche had always measured themselves by how they treated the most vulnerable members of their community, and turning away a child in need would diminish them in ways that went beyond politics or safety. He promised to take personal responsibility for any consequences that arose from keeping her, and he asked the tribe to trust him as they had once trusted him before grief drove him into isolation. The council deliberated long into the night, with arguments flowing back and forth like a river finding its course. Finally, as the fire burned low and stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, a consensus emerged. Morning Star would be accepted as Running Elk's adopted daughter and as a member of the tribe, with all the protection and rights that status conveyed. However, they would need to be cautious and prepared for questions or challenges from settlers or authorities. The decision was not without risk, but it was the decision that honored who they were as a people. Over the following weeks, Running Elk's hidden valley became less hidden and more of a gathering place. Other families from scattered Comanche groups began visiting, drawn by word that Swift Arrow's band had established a seasonal camp in the mountains. The valley's natural defenses and abundant water made it an ideal location, and gradually it transformed into a small community. Running Elk found himself surrounded by people again, participating in hunts and councils, teaching young warriors tracking skills, and slowly remembering what it felt like to be part of something larger than his own solitary existence. Morning Star thrived in this environment, with a speed that amazed everyone who witnessed it. Children were naturally accepting, and she quickly made friends among the Comanche youth, learning their games and language with the effortless ability of the young. Singing Bird dressed her in traditional clothing that she had lovingly crafted, And the little girl seemed to take pride in her new identity, though she never forgot where she came from. Sometimes Running Elk would find her standing alone, looking toward the distant lowlands where settler communities lay, and he knew she was thinking about the family she had lost. In those moments, he would sit beside her without speaking, offering the comfort of presence without trying to erase her grief with empty words. The true test of their new arrangement came on a cool autumn morning when a small group of Texas Rangers rode into the valley, following rumors of a white child being held by a Comanche band. Running Elk saw them coming and had time to prepare, gathering Swift Arrow and several other leaders to meet the Rangers before they reached the camp. The confrontation could have turned dangerous, but Running Elk stepped forward and explained in clear English that he had found an orphaned child and taken her in to save her life, that she was being cared for and loved, and that she was free to speak for herself about whether she felt safe or threatened. The Rangers, led by a weathered captain named Thomas who had seen too much conflict and was tired of it, agreed to speak with Morning Star. The little girl came forward holding Running Elk's hand, and when asked if she wanted to leave or stay, she surprised everyone by responding clearly. She said that Running Elk had saved her when she was lost and scared, that Singing Bird took care of her like a grandmother, and that she had friends here who played with her every day. She asked if she could stay with her new family, speaking with the simple honesty that only a child could manage, cutting through all the complex politics and prejudices to the basic human truth beneath. Captain Thomas looked at Morning Star, then at the Comanche gathered protectively around her, then back at Running Elk's steady gaze. He saw a community that had taken in an orphan child and given her safety and love when they could have simply left her to die or returned her to uncertain care among strangers. He saw a warrior who had overcome his own grief to give a lost child a second chance at family. After a long moment of consideration, Thomas made a decision that would likely cost him professionally, but which his conscience demanded. He told Running Elk that as far as he was concerned, he had found no evidence of wrongdoing, that the child appeared healthy and happy, and that he would report that the situation was resolved appropriately. As the Rangers rode away, Swift Arrow placed his hand on his brother's shoulder and smiled. Running Elk had not only reclaimed his place in the tribe, but had also navigated a dangerous encounter with wisdom and courage that reminded everyone why he had once been respected as a warrior and leader. More importantly, he had protected Morning Star and validated the tribe's decision to take her in, proving that compassion and principle could coexist with the hard realities of frontier life. Winter arrived in the Texas hill country with unexpected ferocity, bringing storms that howled through the mountain passes and blanketed the valley in snow that transformed the landscape into something from a dream. Running Elk's cabin, which had been built for one person's solitary survival, now housed a family. Morning Star slept in a bed that Running Elk had crafted with his own hands, using techniques his father had taught him decades ago. Singing Bird had moved into a small addition that Swift Arrow and other warriors helped build onto the cabin, and the structure that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with conversation, laughter, and the daily routines of family life. Morning Star's transformation over the months was remarkable to witness. The frightened, traumatized child who had emerged from the forest was gradually becoming a confident young girl who moved between two worlds with increasing ease. She spoke Comanche fluently now, though she maintained her English as well, creating a unique linguistic bridge that proved valuable when traders or travelers passed through the area. She learned traditional skills from Singing Bird, becoming adept at beadwork, hide preparation, and plant identification. She also learned hunting and tracking from Running Elk, showing an aptitude that surprised and pleased him. But perhaps the most significant change was in Running Elk himself. The hollow, grief-stricken man who had fled to the mountains 5 years ago had gradually filled with purpose and renewed connection to life. Having Morning Star depend on him, trust him, and look to him for guidance and protection had awakened something he thought had died with his first family. He found himself planning for the future again, thinking about what skills Morning Star would need as she grew, what lessons he could teach her, how he could prepare her for a world that would never be simple or easy for someone who walked between cultures. The community that had formed in the valley flourished through the winter months despite the harsh conditions. The families supported each other through storms and shortages, sharing resources and labor in the traditional ways that had sustained their people for generations. Running Elk found himself taking on more responsibilities, serving as a scout and advisor, helping resolve disputes, and teaching younger members of the tribe. Swift Arrow watched his brother's renaissance with satisfaction, knowing that bringing the tribe to this valley had been exactly the right decision. As spring approached and the snow began to melt, revealing the green grass beneath, new challenges emerged that would test the fragile peace they had built. Word had spread throughout the region about the Comanche community in the mountains and the white child being raised among them. Most responses were neutral or positive, particularly from people who knew Captain Thomas's report. But there were those who saw the situation as evidence of dangerous mixing of races and cultures. A group of settlers led by a man named Harrison, who had recently arrived from the east with rigid ideas about how the frontier should be organized, began agitating for action to remove the Comanche from the area and recover the child. Running Elk learned of these developments through his network of contacts, which now included sympathetic traders and even a few settlers who valued peace over ideology. He called a council to discuss how to respond to the growing pressure. Some warriors argued for moving the camp to a more remote location, while others suggested that Running Elk should take Morning Star and return to his solitary life to remove the focal point of controversy. But Swift Arrow proposed a different approach, one that was risky but potentially more effective. He suggested they invite the concerned settlers to visit the camp, to see for themselves how Morning Star lived, and let her speak about her own wishes and well-being. The proposal was controversial and required considerable debate before being accepted. Inviting potential enemies into their camp went against every survival instinct, but it also represented an opportunity to demonstrate their peaceful intentions and the genuine care they provided for Morning Star. Running Elk supported his brother's plan, arguing that hiding would only feed rumors and suspicions, while openness might build the understanding that would ensure long-term safety for everyone involved. The council eventually agreed, though with careful conditions and preparations to ensure the tribe's security during such a visit. The meeting was arranged for a warm spring day when the valley was at its most beautiful, with wildflowers blooming across the meadows and new foals playing among the horse herds. Harrison arrived with about a dozen other settlers, their expressions ranging from curious to openly hostile. Running Elk and Swift Arrow greeted them formally, with Morning Star standing between them, dressed in traditional Comanche clothing but speaking in clear English to welcome the visitors. Her confident bearing and obvious health immediately undercut some of the darkest rumors that had been circulating. The settlers were given a tour of the camp, shown how the community functioned, and allowed to observe daily life without restriction. They saw children playing together, families working cooperatively, and a social structure that was different from their own, but clearly functional and caring. Morning Star answered questions directly, explaining that she had been lost and would have died if Running Elk had not found her, that she had been welcomed and loved by her new family, and that while she sometimes missed her original parents, she was happy and wanted to stay where she was. Harrison remained skeptical and argued that a white child belonged with white people, that she was being raised in primitive conditions, and that her presence among the Comanche was unnatural and wrong. But his companions were less certain, particularly after spending hours in the camp and seeing the reality rather than the rumors. One woman, who had lost her own husband and understood the fragility of family on the frontier, spoke up defending Running Elk's decision to care for an orphaned child. She pointed out that Morning Star could have been placed in an overcrowded orphanage back east, or bound out as a servant to strangers, and that neither option would have provided the love and security she clearly had here. The visit did not convert all the skeptics, but it accomplished something important. It humanized the situation, replacing abstract fears with concrete observations, and it gave Morning Star a voice in determining her own future. When the settlers finally departed, several expressed genuine respect for what they had witnessed, even if they did not fully understand or approve of it. Harrison left still grumbling about impropriety and unnatural arrangements, but his influence had been diminished by the evidence that contradicted his prejudices. That evening, as the camp settled into its usual routines after the tension of the visit, Running Elk sat outside his cabin with Morning Star beside him. She leaned against his shoulder in comfortable silence, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. Running Elk thought about the journey that had brought them both to this moment, from his devastating loss and self-imposed exile, to finding a frightened child in the forest and choosing connection over continued isolation. He had not saved Morning Star alone. She had also saved him, giving him a reason to rejoin the world and remember that love was always worth the risk of loss. Morning Star spoke quietly, asking Running Elk if she would always be able to stay with him, and Singing Bird if the angry settlers would try to take her away. Running Elk chose his words carefully, not wanting to lie but also not wanting to frighten her unnecessarily. He told her that as long as he drew breath, he would protect her and keep her safe, that she was his daughter in every way that mattered, and that their family and tribe would stand together against anyone who tried to separate them. Morning Star nodded, satisfied with this promise, and squeezed his hand before heading inside to where Singing Bird waited with warm tea and evening stories. 3 years had passed since that autumn evening when Running Elk found a lost child crying in the forest, and those years had transformed both of their lives in ways neither could have imagined. Morning Star was now 9 years old, tall for her age and confident in ways that reflected her unique upbringing between two cultures. She moved through the camp with the easy grace of someone completely at home, greeting elders respectfully in Comanche, joking with other children in a mixture of languages, and helping with daily tasks that ranged from tending horses to gathering medicinal plants in the surrounding mountains. The community in the valley had grown as well, evolving from a temporary camp into something more permanent and substantial. More families had joined over the years, drawn by the valley's natural resources, its defensive position, and the reputation of Swift Arrow's leadership and Running Elk's wisdom. The Comanche camp now included over 100 people, with permanent structures replacing many of the temporary shelters, gardens producing substantial food supplies, and a horse herd that was the envy of the region. They had created a small but thriving community that demonstrated indigenous resilience and adaptability in changing times. Running Elk had fully reclaimed his place as a respected member of the tribe, serving as a chief scout and advisor on matters requiring careful judgment and diplomacy. His relationship with Morning Star had deepened into the genuine bond of father and daughter, built on daily interactions, shared experiences, and mutual love that transcended their different origins. Singing Bird had become the grandmother Morning Star had never known, teaching her traditional stories and skills, while also respecting her connection to her settler heritage. The little girl carried both identities with increasing ease, seeing them not as conflicting, but as complementary parts of who she was becoming. The broader relationship between the Comanche community and the surrounding settlers had also evolved, though not without ongoing challenges. Captain Thomas had proven to be an ally, using his influence to ensure that the valley camp was left in peace and treated as a legitimate community rather than a threat. Some settlers, including the woman who had defended Running Elk during Harrison's visit, had developed trading relationships with the camp, exchanging goods and occasionally sharing knowledge about weather, trail conditions, and other practical matters that benefited everyone in the region. But tensions remained, particularly as more settlers arrived from the east with expectations that the land should be available for their exclusive use and development. Harrison had left the area in frustration, but others shared his views that the Comanche should be removed to distant reservations to make room for expanding ranches and farms. The federal government's policies were moving steadily in that direction, and everyone in the valley understood that their peaceful existence might not last forever. The question was not if change would come, but when and whether they could maintain their community and values in the face of overwhelming pressure. The crisis arrived on a warm June morning when a delegation of government officials, accompanied by a military escort, rode into the valley with papers and proclamations. They carried orders from Washington, directing all Comanche people in the region to relocate to a designated reservation in Oklahoma Territory. The deadline was 60 days, after which military force would be used to compel compliance. The officials were not hostile, just bureaucratic, explaining that this was policy decided at levels far above them and that resistance would be both futile and dangerous. Swift Arrow called an emergency council that included all the adult members of the community. The debate was passionate and painful, with warriors arguing for resistance, elders counseling caution, and families worrying about the safety of their children. Running Elk listened to all perspectives before speaking, and when he did, his words carried the weight of someone who had experienced profound loss and understood what truly mattered. He reminded them that their strength as a people had always been their ability to adapt while maintaining their core values, that survival sometimes required difficult choices, and that protecting their children and preserving their culture mattered more than any particular piece of land. But he also proposed an alternative that had been forming in his mind for months as he watched the political situation deteriorate. Running Elk suggested that instead of moving to the distant reservation, they should negotiate to purchase the valley and surrounding land legally, establishing it as private property owned by the tribe collectively. It was an unconventional idea that required working within the settler legal system, but it might offer protection that resistance could never provide. Some members of the tribe were skeptical, but Swift Arrow immediately understood the strategic value of the proposal and threw his support behind it. The plan required resources they did not currently possess, particularly money to purchase the land and hire lawyers to navigate the complex legal processes. Running Elk proposed selling part of their substantial horse herd, which had grown valuable through careful breeding and care. He also suggested reaching out to their settler allies, including Captain Thomas and the trading partners, who had proven trustworthy, to seek support and advice. It was a gamble that required trust in systems and people who had often failed indigenous communities, but the alternative was losing everything with certainty rather than a chance at preservation. Over the next weeks, Running Elk and Swift Arrow worked tirelessly to make the plan reality. They sold horses to buyers as far away as San Antonio, raising substantial funds while maintaining enough breeding stock to rebuild the herd over time. Captain Thomas proved invaluable, introducing them to a lawyer in Austin who had experience with land claims and who was genuinely sympathetic to their cause. The lawyer explained the complex process of establishing legal title and helped them navigate the bureaucratic requirements that seemed designed to confuse and discourage. Morning Star played an unexpected role in building support for their cause. Her presence in the community, and her obvious thriving under Running Elk's care, had become symbolic of the positive potential when different peoples chose cooperation over conflict. When settlers questioned why they should support Comanche land ownership, Morning Star would sometimes accompany Running Elk to meetings, her very existence challenging simplistic narratives about civilization and savagery. She spoke about her life in the valley, her education that included both traditional knowledge and English literacy, and her hope that different communities could respect each other's right to exist and flourish. The process was long and frustrating, requiring patience with officials who seemed more interested in obstacles than solutions. There were setbacks and delays, moments when it seemed the entire effort would collapse under the weight of bureaucratic indifference or political opposition. But slowly, piece by piece, they assembled the legal framework they needed. The land was surveyed and appraised, the funds were transferred, and the paperwork was filed with territorial authorities. Finally, on a day in late summer, just before the relocation deadline would have forced their hand, the deed was recorded, establishing the valley and surrounding territory as legally owned property of the Comanche community. The celebration that night was profound, mixing relief with joy and the knowledge that they had achieved something remarkable. They had not defeated the tide of change sweeping across Texas, but they had carved out a space where they could maintain their community and culture on their own terms within the new legal reality. It was adaptation without surrender, preservation through innovation, and survival through wisdom rather than resistance. Swift Arrow spoke before the gathered families, honoring his brother Running Elk for the vision that had saved them, and honoring Morning Star as a symbol of the bridges they would continue to build with the changing world around them. Running Elk stood with his daughter beside him, his mother on his other side, surrounded by his tribe and feeling more complete than he had since losing his first family so many years ago. He thought about that evening when he had heard a child crying in the forest and made the choice to help rather than turn away. That single decision, born from compassion overcoming grief and isolation, had led to this moment of community triumph and hope. Morningstar looked up at him and smiled, squeezing his hand in the gesture that had become their private signal of connection and love. Years later, the Valley community would continue to face challenges and changes as Texas evolved from frontier to settled territory. But they would face those changes from a position of legal security and with the knowledge that they had proven indigenous people could navigate the new systems while maintaining their identity and values. Running Elk would live to see Morningstar grow into a young woman who moved confidently between worlds, eventually becoming a teacher who shared both Comanche and settler knowledge with the next generation of children from all backgrounds. And always, Running Elk would remember that night when the valley filled with horses and his brother offered him a path back to life and family. He would remember the small hand gripping his shirt as he led a frightened child to safety, and the years of joy that followed from choosing connection over isolation. The warrior who had thought his story ended in grief had discovered instead that it was only beginning, and that the greatest battles were not fought with weapons, but with the courage to open one's heart to love, despite the certainty of eventual loss. In the end, that courage had saved not just one orphaned girl, but had saved Running Elk himself, restoring him to his people and giving his life meaning that would echo through generations yet to come.